It was a typical Tuesday morning in the courtroom, with the faint echo of shuffling feet and the low murmur of whispered conversations. The judge, a seasoned woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, adjusted her glasses and glanced down at the case file. I couldn't help but notice her lack of enthusiasm as she prepared to begin. I was about to witness something I never expected. The defendant, a farmer named Thomas Taylor, stood at the front, his hands resting calmly at his sides. He had an air of quiet confidence about him, someone who had worked the land his whole life, his hands weathered by years of hard labor. But there was something else that marked him, his accent. Thick, with a rural southern drawl, it was the kind of accent that immediately set him apart from the polished, professional crowd in the courtroom. I saw the judge's lips curl into a subtle smirk as she glanced at him. The corner of her mouth twitched in amusement, and I knew she was preparing for something. What I didn't expect was the venom that followed. "Well, Mr. Taylor," the judge began, her voice dripping with a mocking tone, "could you please repeat that? I'm not sure I caught your charming accent." The room went quiet. Thomas stood still, his face expressionless. I could tell he was choosing his words carefully, holding back whatever he might have been thinking. The judge's eyes gleamed with amusement as she waited for him to stumble, to give her more ammunition to ridicule him. I held my breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Something in the air shifted, something told me this wasn't going to end how the judge had imagined. The judge's words hung in the air like a blade ready to drop, but Thomas Taylor didn't flinch. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then spoke again. His voice was calm, measured, but this time, there was something in his tone that had changed. "Your Honor," he began, his drawl still there but no longer a source of embarrassment, "I've spent my life growing crops and tending to animals. I've never had the luxury of sitting behind a desk or speaking in the manner you might expect in a courtroom." He paused for a moment, allowing the words to settle. "But I've seen things and learned things that some folks in this room will never understand. So, if my accent bothers you, maybe it's because you don't know what it's like to work the land, day in and day out. To live with the seasons, the soil, and the sweat of your labor." There was a long silence that followed. The judge's smirk faltered as she tried to mask her discomfort, but it was clear, her power in that moment was slipping. Thomas Taylor wasn't reacting the way she expected. He wasn't apologizing for who he was, nor was he giving her the satisfaction of stumbling over his words. I could see her searching for something to retort, to bring back the upper hand. But there was something about Thomas's voice, steady and unyielding, that made it hard for her to keep her composure. The rest of the room was dead silent, as if waiting for the next move. The tension was palpable. "Go on, Mr. Taylor," the judge finally muttered, her tone lacking its previous bite. "You were saying." But instead of taking the bait, Thomas stood his ground, his posture unchanged. "What I'm saying is," he said with a quiet strength, "people like me, we're judged by more than just the way we talk. We're judged by how hard we work, by what we do with our hands, by the life we lead." The judge's face flushed. The room was still, and for the first time, I saw a crack in the judge's professional armor. The judge shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly on the bench. The audience in the room remained still, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. It felt as though everything had stopped, as if the entire room was waiting for the judge to decide whether she would double down on her previous comment or accept the weight of Thomas's words. She cleared her throat, attempting to regain control. "Well, Mr. Taylor," she said, her voice still holding an edge, but not as sharp as before, "I appreciate your perspective. But this is a courtroom, not a farm. We deal with facts and proper protocol here." For a brief moment, her eyes flickered toward the prosecutor, seeking some sort of backup, but the prosecutor avoided her gaze, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was unfolding. Thomas didn't back down. "I know where I stand, Your Honor. I may not know your protocol, but I know the truth when I see it. And the truth is, I've been through a lot more than you'll ever read in a book." The words hit hard, sharper than anyone expected. The judge visibly winced, though she quickly masked it with a stiff smile. But the damage had been done. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. "Fine," the judge said, her tone now cold, "but you will address the court with respect, Mr. Taylor, or I will hold you in contempt." For a moment, I thought the tension would break. But instead, something unexpected happened. Thomas nodded, his expression unchanged, and in that instant, it was clear, he wasn't going to let her get away with this. "I've got nothing but respect, Your Honor," he replied evenly, "but I won't let anyone disrespect me, not for something I have no control over." The judge's eyes narrowed, but there was a pause, a long, uncomfortable silence. And just like that, the tone of the courtroom shifted once more. The judge's fingers clenched around the gavel, her knuckles white with the strain. It was clear she didn't expect her mocking to be met with such resistance. The entire courtroom was on edge, as if everyone knew the next words would either defuse the tension or escalate it even further. "Mr. Taylor," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly, "you're walking a fine line here. I've tolerated your responses, but you must understand, this is a court of law. We adhere to standards." Thomas stood tall, his hands clasped in front of him, his posture never wavering. "Your Honor," he said, his voice unwavering, "I'm just here for the truth. You can question my accent, but it won't change what I've worked for, and it won't change who I am." The room fell silent, save for the quiet rustle of papers being shifted. The judge looked at him for a long moment, her eyes scanning his face, looking for something, perhaps an opening for a sharp retort or a hint of weakness. But there was none. Thomas was calm, collected, as if he had long since come to terms with the challenges life had thrown his way. The judge, perhaps sensing the shift in control, tried to regain some footing. "Let's get back to the case," she said with a quick change in tone, though it lacked its usual authority. She rifled through the papers before her, but the words that followed were weak. "Mr. Taylor, you may proceed. But keep it brief." Thomas nodded, and for the first time, he addressed the jury directly. "I'm not here to talk about my accent or my background," he said, his voice carrying a weight that filled the courtroom. "I'm here to speak the truth about what happened on my farm. I'm here because my land was taken from me. And I'm here because that land means everything to me. My family worked it for generations." It was as if the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted entirely. The judge no longer had the upper hand. The jury, once distracted by the judge's treatment of Thomas, was now fully focused on the man standing before them. His words, simple yet powerful, had silenced the room. The judge, now visibly flustered, shifted her gaze to the clerk, almost as if looking for a way to regain her composure. But nothing could undo the damage that had been done. The courtroom knew the truth now, and it was no longer about the accent or the mockery, it was about respect. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Everyone's eyes were on Thomas Taylor, who had reclaimed the attention that had been stolen by the judge's cruel words. Even the judge, who had once been the uncontested authority in the room, was now silent, her authority shaken. But then, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, Thomas began to speak again, this time with an even stronger sense of purpose. "Let me tell you something," he said, his voice steady but filled with raw emotion. "My family didn't just work the land. We fought for it. We bled for it. And we've seen a lot of people try to take it from us, people who think they're better because they talk a certain way or wear a suit to court. But it's not the clothes or the accent that make a man. It's the heart and the hands that work the land." I saw the jury members exchange glances, their expressions now thoughtful, as though the courtroom had just been shaken awake from a deep sleep. Thomas was no longer just the farmer being mocked, he was a man telling a story that went beyond the narrow confines of this courtroom. The judge, still standing at her bench, couldn't hide her discomfort any longer. She had underestimated Thomas, and in doing so, she had unintentionally given him the power to shift the narrative in the room. Her grip on the gavel loosened as she shifted in her seat, clearly struggling to regain control of the situation. Then, to everyone's surprise, something happened. The prosecutor, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stood up and cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said, surprising everyone, "I think it's time we refocus on the matter at hand. The witness has already shown the jury the truth of his story. Perhaps we should allow him to finish his statement without further interruptions." The judge's eyes widened as the prosecutor spoke, and for a moment, she looked almost taken aback. She quickly composed herself, her face settling back into its usual stern expression. "Proceed, Mr. Taylor," she said, though it lacked the authority it once had. Thomas nodded and turned back toward the jury, the air in the room now different, charged, tense, but now also more respectful. "I'm here today because someone tried to take what belongs to me. And I'll be damned if I let anyone mock me or my family over something we've earned. So, let's get this straight. The truth is the only thing that matters." There was a shift in the room as the jurors looked at each other, their faces more serious now, listening with intent. Though mass words had struck a chord, reverberating through the courtroom like the final echo of a storm. For the first time in the entire trial, the atmosphere shifted completely. The usual tension that often accompanies a courtroom battle was replaced by something else, something almost tangible. Respect. The jury, once unsure and distracted, seemed to focus entirely on Thomas, hanging on his every word. The judge, still seated but clearly shaken, gripped her gavel, unsure whether to regain control or let the moment unfold. The prosecutor, having spoken up to give Thomas a voice, sat back down, his expression unreadable but his stance open. The courtroom had collectively witnessed something that couldn't be taken back, a raw, unfiltered truth spoken by a man who was tired of being underestimated. I noticed one juror, a woman in her mid-40s, nodding slightly, as if Thomas's words resonated deeply with her. Another juror, a younger man, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly reconsidering his initial judgment. The whole room seemed to be going through an unspoken transformation, realizing that this trial was not just about land or legalities, it was about the very values that held them all together. The judge, now visibly flustered, cleared her throat. "Mr. Taylor, I don't believe I need to remind you that you are in a court of law, not a pulpit," she said, her voice lacking its earlier mockery but still holding an edge of condescension. Thomas didn't flinch. "Your Honor," he said, his tone level and firm, "I'm just speaking the truth. If you can't handle the truth, that's not my problem. But I won't stand by while someone tries to make me feel less than because of where I'm from or how I talk. Not in this room. Not anywhere." His words hung in the air, and this time, there was no witty retort from the judge. She didn't have the power to deflect anymore. The courtroom had gone quiet once again, but it was a different kind of silence, one of understanding, not tension. As the judge struggled for a response, the same juror who had been nodding earlier leaned forward, catching the judge's eye. "Your Honor," she spoke up, her voice clear and strong, "I think we've heard enough. Mr. Taylor deserves the respect he's asking for. We should let him finish." The judge's gaze flickered toward the woman, her face tightening with the realization that she wasn't going to be able to control this narrative the way she had planned. But instead of snapping back at the juror, the judge hesitated. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. The courtroom had changed. The balance of power had shifted. The judge, her gaze lingering on the juror who had spoken up, seemed to momentarily lose her authority. The courtroom was no longer a place where she could wield her usual control over every word spoken. The truth in Thomas's words had already made its mark, and there was no going back. A long silence stretched out. The judge's grip on the gavel tightened, but she made no move to speak. She was wrestling with herself, clearly aware that the situation had taken an unexpected turn. For a brief moment, she was no longer the commanding figure behind the bench. Instead, she was just another person in the room, trying to maintain composure. "Proceed, Mr. Taylor," she said after a pause, her voice now softer, but still carrying the weight of someone who wasn't entirely willing to surrender control. Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving the jury. There was something almost reverential about the way he spoke now, not just for the sake of the trial, but for the value of his own experience. The weight of his words carried not just his life struggles but the history of his ancestors, who had worked the land long before him. As I was saying, Thomas continued, this land was built with blood, sweat, and tears. My ancestors worked it, fought for it, and made sure it stayed in the family. It's not just dirt under our feet, it's the backbone of who we are. His voice grew more passionate with each sentence, and I could see that the jury was feeling it. They were no longer hearing a simple case about land ownership, they were witnessing a man telling his story, a story that was bigger than any courtroom. I'm not here asking for pity or for special treatment, he said, I'm here because what's mine is mine. And no one is going to take that from me. Not because of how I talk. Not because of where I'm from. But because I've earned it. There was a hum in the room, a shift in the very air around us. The judge, who had once stood as an obstacle between Thomas and justice, was now a mere spectator to the truth that had unfolded before her. Then, without warning, another juror, a man in his 50s, a quiet type who had been observing the entire time, spoke up. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady but firm, I think Mr. Taylor has made his point. We should respect him for it. It was a simple statement, but the impact was immediate. The judge didn't reply. Instead, she simply nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if she knew there was nothing more to say. Thomas stood tall, the fire in his eyes undeniable. He was no longer just defending his land, he was defending his dignity. And the entire courtroom knew it. The courtroom had grown thick with tension, but this time it was different. It wasn't the tension of a legal battle, but of something deeper, something personal. The walls, once filled with the cold sterility of law and order, now seemed to echo with the weight of history, tradition, and pride. The judge remained silent, her eyes fixed on Thomas, though there was no longer any mockery in her gaze, only an unspoken acknowledgement of his strength and resolve. The jury, on the other hand, was no longer just a group of neutral observers. They had become part of the story, witnesses to an exchange that went far beyond the boundaries of the case at hand. Thomas Taylor, the farmer who had been ridiculed for his accent, now stood at the center of the room with a newfound confidence. He wasn't just defending his land, he was defending his identity, his family, and the very essence of who he was. The prosecutor, who had been silent since his brief interjection, now seemed uncertain. It was as if he, too, had realized that this case was no longer about the facts he had prepared, but about something much more powerful, the human spirit. Your Honor, Thomas continued, his voice steady, this case isn't about me. It's about what's right. It's about respect. I've been treated as less than because of how I speak, because of where I come from, and I've had enough. The land I'm standing on is mine, and I won't let anyone take it. Not today. Not ever. The room fell silent once again, but this time, there was no tension. It was a heavy, respectful silence. The kind of silence that happens when everyone in the room understands that something significant has just happened. The judge looked down at her desk for a moment, perhaps trying to regain her composure. When she looked up again, her expression was no longer cold or dismissive. There was a shift, a subtle but important change. Mr. Taylor, she began, her voice quieter now, you've made your point. You may proceed. But Thomas didn't need her to grant him permission anymore. The room was his, and the truth had already spoken louder than any gavel or courtroom ruling ever could. With a final glance toward the jury, Thomas spoke the closing words that would seal his place in their minds, the truth will always stand taller than any judge's gavel. I'm not asking for mercy. I'm asking for what's mine, and I'll fight for it until the end. And with that, he turned to the jury, who had been watching him with newfound respect, their eyes locked on him as if to say, we hear you. As Thomas's words echoed in the still air, I could feel the collective breath of the courtroom held in suspension, waiting for what would come next. The judge, though silent, seemed to have resigned herself to the undeniable force of Thomas' argument. Her earlier arrogance had faded, replaced by something else, an understanding, perhaps, or simply the quiet realization that she could no longer hold sway over this case. The jury, however, was another matter. Their expressions had softened, no longer guarded or skeptical. The words Thomas had spoken weren't just about his case, they were about all the injustices that had gone unnoticed, about the silent battles fought by people like him, day after day, year after year. And now, those words had carved a space in their minds, one that could not easily be erased. The foreman of the jury, a man in his early 50s, with graying hair and a stern, no-nonsense look, sat forward in his chair. His eyes met the rest of the jury, and for a moment, they exchanged silent glances. The shift in their demeanor was evident, as they absorbed the weight of the truth Thomas had so boldly shared. After a long moment of deliberation, the foreman stood and addressed the court, his voice measured but firm. "Your Honor, members of the court, after careful consideration, we, the jury, have reached a unanimous decision." The judge nodded, her expression now neutral, though there was a slight tremor in her hands as she prepared to hear the verdict. The rest of the courtroom leaned forward, their anticipation palpable. "The evidence presented," the foreman continued, "and the testimony of Mr. Taylor have shown us that this land is rightfully his. We find in favor of Mr. Taylor. The claim against him is dismissed. He is entitled to keep his land." The room seemed to exhale all at once. There was no fanfare, no dramatic applause, but there was a quiet, undeniable sense of relief, of justice finally being served. Thomas, who had remained stoic throughout the proceedings, allowed himself the smallest of smiles, a flicker of triumph that reflected both personal victory and the satisfaction of being seen, of being heard. The judge, though clearly taken aback by the verdict, adjusted herself with professional composure. "Very well," she said, her voice steady, "the jury has spoken. The case is closed." As the courtroom began to empty, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn of events. What had started as a mockery of a man's identity had ended with that very man standing tall, victorious, not because of the law alone but because of the raw, undeniable power of truth. Thomas Taylor had fought not only for his land but for his dignity. And in that courtroom, he had won both. The courtroom began to empty, but the weight of what had just transpired hung in the air like a dense fog. Outside, the world was continuing on as it always did, but for those of us who had witnessed what had happened, nothing would ever feel quite the same. Thomas Taylor had won. Not just the legal battle, but a much deeper, more profound victory. It wasn't just about land rights anymore, it was about reclaiming the respect that had been so easily stripped from him. He had stood in that courtroom not as a man to be mocked, but as a force of nature, unyielding and unbreakable. As Thomas walked out of the courtroom, his head held high, I caught a glimpse of the jurors. They were whispering among themselves, their faces soft, as if they had just witnessed something bigger than they had expected, a story that couldn't be confined to just the facts of the case. They had seen the power of dignity, the strength in a person's conviction. They had seen the importance of hearing someone out, truly listening, and not judging them based on the surface. The judge, meanwhile, retreated behind her bench, her composure faltering only slightly. She would go back to her routine, but something had shifted within her. Perhaps she, too, had learned something. I was left standing there, reflecting on how one moment, one simple story of injustice and defiance, could completely turn the tide. How something as small as an accent could be used as a weapon, one that was meant to humiliate and belittle, but could also be the very thing that brought a man victory. Outside the courtroom, Thomas stepped into the daylight, the harsh sun catching his worn face. For a moment, he stood there, breathing deeply, as though he was taking in the freedom he had fought for. The weight of the years of work, of struggle, seemed to lift off his shoulders. He had reclaimed his dignity. He didn't speak a word to anyone as he walked away from the courthouse, but his posture spoke volumes. He wasn't just a farmer anymore, he was a man who had been wronged and who had righted that wrong, standing tall and proud in the face of adversity. And as I left the courthouse too, I couldn't help but think that, sometimes, the truth isn't about facts or legalities. It's about standing firm in who you are, speaking out when you've been wronged, and never letting anyone take away your right to be respected.